Medieval peasants didn't have soap like we do today. No fancy body washes, shampoos, or foamy hand soap. But they weren't just walking dirt clumps either. They had to get creative to stay somewhat clean, or at least avoid smelling like a barnyard disaster. Now, let's dive into how medieval peasants kept clean using rivers, lakes, and rainwater. And trust me, it's not as gross as you might think. Well, maybe a little. You know that feeling when you're camping and haven't showered for days? Well, medieval peasants lived that life 24/7, but they weren't exactly the filthy creatures we sometimes imagine. In fact, they were pretty creative when it came to staying clean without fancy soaps and indoor plumbing. Rivers and lakes were basically their local spa centers. Instead of paying $50 for a day pass, peasants would trek down to the nearest water source and take a good old-fashioned dip. Of course, these weren't exactly the crystal-clear waters you'd find at a modern resort. Picture more of a murky soup with a dash of animal waste and whatever else happened to float downstream. But hey, beggars can't be choosers, right? It's surprising how medieval peasants actually bathed more often than most people think. Historical records from English villages show that river bathing was a regular activity, especially during the warmer months. One account from a 13th century village mentions how the local miller complained about too many naked bodies blocking his water wheel. I guess you could say it was the medieval version of pool crowding. Rain was basically their version of a free shower subscription. When those dark clouds rolled in, peasants would often strip down to their undergarments and let nature do its thing. They'd even collect rainwater in wooden barrels for later use. Talk about an early version of water conservation. Though I can't help but wonder what the local priest thought about all these people dancing around in the rain. Probably blaming it on those wild pagan traditions or something. But medieval people had some surprisingly sophisticated ideas about hygiene. They believed that opening your pores with hot water and then closing them with cold water was good for health. Modern science actually backs this up. Alternating temperatures can improve circulation and boost the immune system. Who knew our ancestors were onto something? The whole bathing situation wasn't just about getting clean, it was also a social activity. Think of it as their version of going to the coffee shop, except everyone was naked and probably a bit smelly. Women would gather to wash clothes and themselves, sharing the latest village gossip. Men would often bathe together after working in the fields. There are even records of villages having designated bathing days, usually before Sunday church services, because nothing says, "I'm ready to praise the Lord," like not smelling like last week's manure. Of course, winter was a different story altogether. When the rivers froze over and the rain turned to snow, staying clean became more challenging. Most peasants would resort to what we now call a cat bath, using a damp cloth to wipe down the essential areas. They'd focus on faces, hands, and feet, which makes sense considering those were the parts most likely to be seen by others. The rest? Well, let's just say layers of wool clothing came in handy for more than just warmth. One particularly amusing account from a medieval chronicle describes how a group of peasants broke through river ice to bathe before Christmas Mass, only to have their clothes freeze solid on the bank. They had to waddle back to their houses in frozen garments, looking like walking statues. The local priest apparently used this as a sermon example of why vanity was a sin, though I suspect it had more to do with common sense than divine punishment. Recent archaeological findings have actually shown us that many medieval villages had designated washing areas along riverbanks, complete with wooden platforms and even crude benches. These spots would have been especially busy during festival times and before major religious holidays. Imagine dozens of people lined up along the river, scrubbing away while trying not to fall in. Medieval water aerobics, if you will. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of medieval bathing was their understanding of water flow. Peasants knew to bathe downstream from where they collected drinking water. They also figured out that moving water was cleaner than standing water, something that wouldn't be scientifically proven until centuries later. Though I'm pretty sure they learned this through trial and error rather than careful scientific observation, nothing motivates good hygiene practices quite like a bad case of stomach problems. One fascinating detail from medieval court records shows that some villages actually had bathing wardens, people whose job it was to make sure nobody hogged the best spots or caused trouble during communal bathing times. Imagine being the medieval equivalent of a lifeguard, except instead of watching for drowning, you're making sure Farmer John isn't taking too long scrubbing his back while others wait their turn. Speaking of cleaning up, You won't believe what medieval folks used when they ran out of water, but that's where ashes and sand come into play. Wood ash was the medieval peasants' secret weapon. Every time they lit a fire, which was pretty much every day unless you enjoyed eating raw chicken, they'd collect the leftover ashes. These weren't just any old ashes. They contained potassium carbonate, which is basically nature's soap. The chemistry behind it is actually pretty cool. When mixed with water, it creates a weak alkaline solution that breaks down oils and grease. Today, we pay top dollar for natural skincare products, while medieval peasants were literally using trash to get clean. A medieval cleaning manual from the 1300s recommended mixing wood ash with a bit of urine for extra cleaning power. Before you gag, hear me out. Urine contains ammonia, which is still used in some cleaning products today. Though I have to say, I'm pretty glad we've moved past that particular cleaning hack. Can you imagine trying to sell that at a modern farmer's market? All natural, organic cleaner, now with extra P. Sand was another popular choice, especially near coastal areas. Think of it as medieval exfoliation, rough enough to scrub off dirt, but not so rough that you'd lose a layer of skin. Some clever peasants would mix fine river sand with crushed herbs like lavender or rosemary. Archaeological digs have found small pouches of this mixture in medieval homes, usually near washing areas. It's basically the 12th century version of those fancy salt scrubs people pay $30 for at beauty stores. Scientists studying medieval pottery have found traces of ash residue with surprisingly consistent chemical compositions, suggesting people actually had preferred recipes for their cleaning ash. Some villages even had specific types of trees they'd use for ash making, believing certain woods created better cleaning products. Oak was particularly prized because it produced fine white ash that was less likely to stain clothes, medieval brand loyalty at its finest. Crushed herbs weren't just for making the cleaning mixture smell nice, though that was definitely a bonus when you're using ashes and sand to get clean. Many common medieval herbs like thyme, sage, and mint have natural antibacterial properties. Our ancestors might not have known about germs, but they figured out what worked through good old trial and error. A medieval medical text from 1250 mentions that soldiers who used herb-infused ash to clean wounds had better survival rates. That's some impressive medieval science right there. The whole ash collecting business became such a big deal that some villages had designated ash collectors, usually older women who couldn't do heavy field work anymore. They'd go house to house collecting quality ash and trading it for food or other goods. Talk about a medieval side hustle. One village record from 1386 mentions a woman known as Agnes Ash Gatherer, who apparently made quite a good living from her ash trading business. But it wasn't all sophisticated herb mixtures and carefully curated ashes. Sometimes, especially during long winter months when herbs were scarce, peasants would just grab whatever was available. One amusing court record from 1342 describes a dispute between two neighbors over stolen ashes. Apparently, one guy had been sneaking into his neighbor's yard at night to raid their ash pile. Medieval crime at its finest, folks. The truly desperate times called for creative solutions. When ash and sand weren't available, people would use whatever abrasive material they could find. Crushed eggshells, fine gravel, or even dried and crushed clay. A medieval writer complained about students at Oxford using precious parchment scraps as cleaning rags, much to their professor's horror. I guess some things never change. Students will always find ways to repurpose school supplies. On particularly cold days, when the thought of mixing ash with freezing water seemed about as appealing as hugging a thorn bush, peasants would dry clean themselves by rubbing the ash directly on their skin and then brushing it off. It wasn't perfect, but it helped remove excess oils and dirt. This technique was especially popular among travelers who couldn't exactly carry around buckets of water with them. Recent studies of medieval household waste sites have revealed something pretty interesting. Different regions had their own unique ash mixtures based on local plants. Coastal areas often mixed seaweed ash with their wood ash, while forest regions preferred pine ash mixed with crushed pine needles. Turns out medieval cleaning products had terroir, just like wine. One archaeologist even managed to recreate some of these mixtures and found they were surprisingly effective at removing grease and grime. Some medieval medical texts actually recommended specific cleaning mixtures for different social classes. Apparently, nobles needed gentler ash mixtures because their skin was more delicate, while peasants could handle the rough stuff. I guess even medieval doctors knew how to flatter their wealthy patients. There's even a record of a noble lady complaining that her servants were using her special ash mixture, the medieval equivalent of stealing your expensive shampoo. While we're on the subject of cleaning up with whatever's available, you won't believe what medieval people used when nature called. Forget about fancy toilet paper and wet wipes. Medieval folks had to get creative when nature called. After using those ashes for cleaning their bodies, they faced an even more interesting challenge: cleaning up after doing their business. Your average medieval peasant had a few go-to options when it came to wiping. Leaves were the most common choice, nature's toilet paper, if you will. But not just any leaves would do. They learned pretty quickly which ones work best and which ones they should absolutely avoid. Soft, broad leaves like mullein, also known as cowboy toilet paper, even today, were the premium choice. Imagine having to check every leaf for poison ivy. That's one mistake you'd only make once. Moss was another popular option, and surprisingly practical. It's naturally soft, absorbent, and some species even have mild antibacterial properties. Medieval peasants would collect and dry it specifically for this purpose. Dried moss could be stored for winter use when leaves weren't available. In fact, archaeologists have found traces of moss in medieval latrines, suggesting this wasn't just a one-off solution, but a regular practice. Then there were the hay wipers. Exactly what it sounds like. Dried grass or straw bundled together made a surprisingly effective cleaning tool. A medieval account from 1349 mentions a farmer storing special hay in his outhouse, separate from the animal feed. This might explain why some medieval barns had two hay storage areas, one for the animals and one for other purposes. The communal outhouse situation gets even more interesting. Some places had what was called a wipe stick, basically a wooden stick wrapped in cloth that everyone shared. Yes, you read that right. Shared. These sticks would be soaked in vinegar or salt water between uses, which they thought made them clean enough to use again. A medieval monastery's expense records show regular purchases of cloth specifically for their communal wipe sticks. Talk about saving money on supplies. Wealthier medieval folks sometimes used imported wool cloth, which must have felt like pure luxury compared to leaves and moss. A merchant's record from 1387 actually lists special cleaning cloths as a luxury item, right up there with spices and fine wines. Apparently, having soft material to wipe with was considered a status symbol. Some nobles even had special cloth wipes embroidered with their family crest because nothing says, "I'm rich," like wiping your backside with monogram fabric. The poorest peasants often had to resort to using their left hand and water, which is why the left hand became associated with uncleanliness in many cultures. This practice led to some interesting social rules. Never eat with your left hand, never greet someone with your left hand, and definitely don't wave at the local lord with it. A medieval court record mentions a man being fined for inappropriate use of his right hand at dinner. Apparently, he forgot which hand was his clean one. Archaeological digs at medieval sites have uncovered some fascinating evidence about these practices. In one village cesspit, they found layers of decomposed plant material that, when analyzed, contained a mix of leaves, moss, and grass species that didn't naturally grow together. This suggests people were actually cultivating or collecting specific plants for this purpose. Medieval bathroom planning at its finest. Some medieval towns had regulations about what could be used for wiping in public outhouses. One town's rule book from 1390 specifically banned the use of important documents for wiping. Apparently, some people were stealing pages from the town records for toilet paper. The fine for this offense was pretty steep too. I guess you could say they took their paperwork seriously. The whole situation with cleaning up actually led to some interesting innovations. Some clever medieval folk would keep a small bucket of vinegar water near their outhouses to dampen their cleaning material, creating a medieval version of wet wipes. A monastery's medical text even recommended adding certain herbs to this water to prevent discomfort in delicate areas. Recent studies of medieval hygiene practices have revealed that some communities actually organized their outhouses based on social status. The village leader would get the premium spot, usually uphill and upwind from everyone else. Meanwhile, the poorest villagers had to make do with whatever spot was left. A medieval version of location, 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 if you ask me. The seasonal changes also affected these practices. During summer, people would gather and dry extra leaves and moss, storing them for winter use. One medieval household record mentions a family's winter wipe box. basically a medieval bathroom cabinet. They'd also collect certain types of bark that could be softened and used when other materials were scarce. Talk about planning ahead. But perhaps the most incredible find was in a well-preserved medieval outhouse in York, England. Archaeologists discovered what appears to be a designated cleaning corner, complete with shelves for different materials and even a small container that might have held that vinegar water mixture. It seems some people took their bathroom organization pretty seriously even back then. Speaking of keeping clean in delicate areas, you'll never guess what medieval people used to keep their hair clean. Hair care in medieval times was a whole different ballgame. After dealing with the basics of keeping clean, people had to tackle the challenge of managing their hair. And boy, did they come up with some interesting solutions. Medieval lice combs were actually works of art, if you can believe it. Made from bone, wood, or even precious metals for the wealthy, these combs had two sides, one with wider teeth for detangling and another with superfine teeth for removing lice and their eggs. Archaeologists have found these combs everywhere, from peasant homes to royal palaces. The oldest one discovered dates back to the 9th century and still had preserved lice eggs stuck in it. Talk about a bad hair day that lasted over 1,000 years. The winner of medieval hair care were herbs. People would steep rosemary, lavender, and sage in vinegar or wine to create hair rinses that actually worked. Modern science has proven these herbs have natural insecticidal properties. A 13th century recipe book recommended rubbing crushed bay leaves into the scalp to keep lice away. And wouldn't you know it, bay leaves contain natural compounds that repel insects. These medieval folks were accidentally doing science. One particular hair treatment deserves a special mention: urine. Yes, you read that right. Some medieval people would wash their hair in stale urine, claiming it made their hair lighter and cleaner. The ammonia in urine does actually have a bleaching effect. It's the same chemical that makes modern hair bleach work. Though personally, I think I'll stick with my store-bought shampoo rather than waiting for my hair wash to ferment. Rich people had their own fancy hair care routines. A noblewoman's beauty manual from 1395 recommended a hair mask made from egg whites, honey, and alum. The funny part? Scientists recently tested this recipe and found it actually forms a protein-rich conditioning treatment. Some high-end salons today charge hundreds for similar all-natural treatments. The medieval solution to dandruff was pretty creative too. They'd rub their scalps with a mixture of ground mustard seeds and vinegar. Modern research shows mustard seeds contain compounds that fight fungal infections, which is exactly what causes dandruff. A court record from 1378 mentions a merchant being caught selling fake premium mustard seeds for hair care. Even back then, people were trying to make a quick buck off beauty products. The medieval barber's toolkit would make modern hairstylists laugh. Besides scissors and combs, they used special scrapers to remove lice eggs, herbal powders to absorb grease, and even small tongs heated in the fire to curl hair. A guild record from 1342 lists the required tools for a qualified barber, including something called a nitpicker's lamp for better visibility during delousing sessions. But the most fascinating aspect of medieval hair care was how it became a social activity. Women would gather to help each other with complex braiding and delousing sessions. These grooming circles were like medieval beauty salons, where people would share gossip, arrange marriages, and even conduct business deals while picking lice out of each other's hair. Talk about multitasking. Archaeological evidence shows that some medieval communities had designated grooming houses where people would gather for hair care. These buildings often had good lighting, which is rare for medieval times, and special benches arranged in circles. One well-preserved site in York even had a collection of dropped hairpins, combs, and small mirrors, basically a medieval beauty parlor frozen in time. Recent analysis of medieval hair care recipes shows they were surprisingly sophisticated. For example, a treatment for dry hair combines egg yolks, olive oil, and crushed rose petals, ingredients that modern science confirms are rich in proteins, healthy fats, and natural moisturizers. A monastery's expense records from 1367 show regular purchases of these ingredients specifically for hair care purposes. The whole business of hair care was taken so seriously that some towns had professional hair inspectors who would check children's heads for lice before they could attend church schools. One particularly amusing court record from 1389 describes a dispute between two such inspectors over territory. Apparently, they had gotten into a fist fight over who had the right to delouse which street. Medieval people even had their own version of dry shampoo. They would sprinkle their hair with powdered herbs and clay, then brush it out thoroughly. This actually helped absorb excess oil and add a pleasant scent. Analysis of a noblewoman's personal grooming kit, found in a 14th century tomb, revealed traces of powdered cloves, lavender, and white clay. Pretty much the same ingredients used in some modern dry shampoos. But perhaps the most unexpected discovery comes from a recently excavated medieval barbershop in London. Archaeologists found evidence of what appears to be a primitive form of hair dye made from walnut shells, iron filings, and wine. Tests showed this concoction could actually create a long-lasting dark color, though it probably wasn't great for hair health, but keeping your hair clean was only half the battle. Medieval folks had some equally interesting ways of keeping their teeth sparkly white. You know that minty fresh feeling you get after brushing your teeth? Well, medieval people wanted fresh breath too. They just had some very different ways of getting it. While we enjoy our electric toothbrushes and fluoride toothpaste, our ancestors were chewing on sticks and using powders that would probably make a modern dentist faint. The most common medieval toothbrush was actually just a twig, but not any old twig would do. People specifically chose branches from aromatic trees like dogwood or cherry. They'd chew one end until it got frayed like a brush, then use it to scrub their teeth. The funny thing is, scientists have found that many of these trees naturally contain compounds that fight bacteria. A monk's diary from 1321 mentions that the monastery's cherry trees were practically stripped bare of small branches, not by thieves wanting cherries, but by people needing toothbrushes. Another record shows a town actually passing laws to protect their dogwood trees from overzealous tooth cleaners. Medieval tooth powder recipes would shock any modern dental hygiene company. Crushed eggshells and chalk were common ingredients, which actually makes sense since they contain calcium carbonate, the same stuff in modern toothpaste. But then things get weird. One popular recipe called for powdered mouse bones mixed with honey and salt. A court record from 1385 shows a merchant being fined for selling counterfeit mouse bone powder. Apparently, he was using regular old chicken bones instead. The court record even mentions the official mouse bone tester who caught him. Now that's a job title you won't find today. The rich folks had their own special dental routines. A noble household's account book from 1374 lists regular purchases of exotic spices just for tooth cleaning. Cloves, mint, and cinnamon weren't just for cooking. They were ground up into tooth powders for the wealthy. The irony? These spices actually do have natural antibacterial properties. Too bad the sugar they also loved pretty much canceled out any benefits. One noble's personal physician wrote extensively about trying to convince his patron to stop eating sugared almonds while spending a fortune on tooth cleaning spices. Salt was another popular teeth cleaning agent, though medieval people tended to mix it with some questionable ingredients. One medical text recommended mixing salt with ground charcoal and sage. Not too bad, actually. But another suggested mixing it with dried powdered frog legs. The idea was that since frogs could live in both water and on land, this would somehow make teeth stronger. Medieval logic at its finest. Archaeological digs have actually found small containers with traces of these mixtures, proving that people really did use these bizarre recipes. The most sophisticated dental care happened in monasteries. Monks kept detailed records of their dental practices, including a fascinating tooth cleaning calendar that specified different cleaning methods for different seasons. Winter called for warming spices like cinnamon, while summer used cooling herbs like mint. One monastery's expense records show they spent as much on dental herbs as they did on wine, and medieval monks really loved their wine. They even developed special prayers to say while cleaning their teeth, believing that spiritual and physical cleanliness went hand in hand. But perhaps the most creative dental innovation was the medieval equivalent of whitening strips. Wealthy people would rub their teeth with a mixture of sage, salt, and rose water, then wrap their teeth in small pieces of linen overnight. A noblewoman's letter from 1392 complains about waking up nearly choking on her tooth cloves. Some things about beauty routines never change. Recent analysis of preserved linens from this period has found traces of herbs and minerals consistent with these tooth whitening treatments. Speaking of fresh breath, vinegar played a huge role in medieval dental care. People would gargle with herb-infused vinegar to freshen their breath. A popular saying went, Vinegar in the morning keeps the tooth drawer away. Their version of an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Archaeological analysis of medieval vinegar pots found traces of mint, thyme, and other herbs that actually do have breath-freshening properties. Some communities even had special vinegar brewers who specialized in making dental rinses. And if you thought medieval dental care was strange, wait until you hear about their creative ways of masking body odor. Before deodorant and perfume existed, medieval people had to get creative with smells. Herbs, vinegar, and those weird little pomander balls weren't just fashion statements. They were serious business in the fight against body odor. Vinegar was the medieval equivalent of Febreze. People would mix it with crushed herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme to create a body spray. A Merchant's Guide from 1367 lists different vinegar recipes for different social classes. The fancy ones included exotic spices like cinnamon and clove, while the budget version was just plain vinegar with whatever local herbs you could find. One town record mentions a guy who made such terrible-smelling vinegar spray that his neighbors took him to court. The judge apparently had to smell multiple vinegar samples as evidence. Definitely not a job perk anyone asked for. Sachets filled with dried herbs were everywhere in medieval homes. They'd stuff them in clothes, hang them from beds, and even sew them into their underwear. A noblewoman's household book from 1382 includes detailed instructions for making these sachets, warning that using the wrong combination could make a person smell like a sick goat rather than a garden. Archaeological digs have found hundreds of these little bags, still containing traces of the herbs used, medieval air fresheners preserved in time. Some sachets were so well preserved that scientists could actually recreate the scent combinations. The most interesting medieval invention for fighting smells was the pomander. These were basically medieval perfume balls, often made from metal and filled with strong-smelling spices. Rich people would carry them around on chains, holding them up to their noses when they encountered something stinky, which was pretty often in medieval times. One court record describes a nobleman who had such a huge pomander that he kept bumping into people with it. Medieval problems require medieval solutions. Another account mentions a lady who lost her gold pomander in a pigsty. Talk about adding insult to injury. But it wasn't just about smelling nice. Medieval people believed that bad smells could actually make you sick. They thought diseases traveled through stinky air, which they called miasma. A doctor's manual from 1348 recommends carrying a pomander as protection against the plague. While their theory about disease was wrong, some of the spices they used, like clove and cinnamon, do have antibacterial properties. Talk about accidentally getting it right. Some towns even had smell regulations. No joke, there are actual medieval laws about where certain smelly activities could take place. A London document from 1371 lists fines for people caught tanning leather too close to the city center. The punishment? They had to provide herbs and spices for the public pomanders for a month. At least they had a sense of humor about their smell problems. These regulations were taken so seriously that some towns had official nose officers who would patrol the streets looking for smell violations. The really wealthy would go all out with their scent solutions. They'd have servants sprinkle herb-scented water on their floors every morning. Some even had special scent gardens where they grew nothing but fragrant plants. A castle inventory from 1395 mentions a perfume room where clothes were stored with layers of rose petals and lavender. Must be nice. Medieval peasants had to make do with hanging their clothes over smoking herb fires. Speaking of herb fires, that was another popular way to fight smells. People would throw bundles of dried herbs on their fires to make the smoke smell better. One village record mentions a dispute between neighbors over someone stealing premium smoking herbs from another's garden. The thief's defense? The other guy's herbs smelled better than his. The judge actually made them swap herb bundles to settle the argument. This apparently started a trend in the village of herb bundle trading. But perhaps the most surprising discovery by archaeologists was the smell schedule found in a monastery. The monks had different scents for different times of day, believing certain smells helped with different activities. Morning prayers energized mint and rosemary, while evening prayers used calming lavender. Modern aromatherapy would approve. The schedule was so detailed, it even specified which scents to use on different religious holidays. Now, medieval folks had some pretty creative ideas about keeping their feet clean. Well, medieval peasants often went barefoot, and surprisingly, that wasn't always a bad thing. Their approach to foot hygiene was a weird mix of practical solutions and some pretty questionable ideas about health. Going barefoot was super common among peasants, especially during warmer months. Modern podiatrists actually say this helped strengthen their feet and prevented a lot of problems we see today from constantly wearing shoes. Archaeological studies of medieval skeletons show that peasants often had healthier foot bones than nobles, Mother Nature's pedicure at work. A medical text from 1356 even praised barefoot walking as nature's way of keeping the humors balanced, though their explanation about earth spirits entering through the toes might need some updating. When they did wear shoes, medieval folks got creative about keeping their feet fresh. They'd stuff their shoes with herbs like mint, rosemary, and thyme. A cobbler's guide from 1378 actually included a section on proper shoe stuffing techniques. Apparently, there was a right and wrong way to pack herbs into your footwear. One wealthy merchant's account book shows he spent almost as much on shoe herbs as he did on the shoes themselves. The same account book mentions the merchant's wife complaining about him storing herbs meant for cooking in the same chest as his shoe herbs, a medieval storage mix-up that probably made for some interesting tasting meals. The really interesting part is how they dealt with sweaty feet in leather shoes. They'd sprinkle a mixture of dried clay and crushed herbs in their shoes to absorb moisture. Modern scientists tested this method and found it works about as well as today's powder products. A monastery's expense records show regular purchases of foot clay, medieval gold bond, if you will. The monks even had special prayers to say while applying it, because apparently even stinky feet needed spiritual guidance. But the noble folks wouldn't be caught dead using peasant remedies. They had their own fancy solutions, like silk stockings soaked in scented vinegar. A noblewoman's letter from 1392 complains about her new stockings being ruined because her servant used the wrong type of vinegar. Medieval, rich people problems. Some wealthy people even had special servants just for foot care called podesters. Yes, that was a real job title. Court records show one podester who became so well known for his foot care skills that he was kidnapped by a rival noble family. Talk about a medieval headhunting practice. Town records show some pretty wild regulations about foot hygiene. Public bathhouses had strict rules about foot washing. You had to clean your feet before entering the main bath. One town actually had a foot inspector who checked people's feet before they could enter certain buildings. A court record from 1367 mentioned someone trying to bribe this inspector with a chicken. Talk about putting your best foot forward. It's fascinating how medieval soldiers developed their own foot care routines that were surprisingly sophisticated. Army documents from 1385 list specific herbs and treatments soldiers had to carry for their feet. They knew that an army marches on its feet, not just its stomach. One military commander was famous for checking his men's feet as often as their weapons. His troops had the lowest rate of foot problems in the army, earning him the nickname the Foot Marshal. His personal diary includes detailed notes about different herb combinations for different seasons and terrains. Archaeological evidence shows medieval people even had designated areas in their homes for foot care. They'd place special stones near their doors, not just for scraping mud off shoes, but also for rubbing their bare feet clean. Scientists found these stones were often made from materials that had natural antibacterial properties. Some have been found with grooves worn into them from centuries of foot scrubbing. Analysis of these stones has revealed traces of various herbs and minerals, suggesting people might have treated the stones with special mixtures to enhance their cleaning properties. The connection between foot health and overall health wasn't lost on medieval doctors either. They believed different parts of the foot connected to different body parts, kind of like modern reflexology. A doctor's manual from 1344 includes detailed foot maps showing which toe supposedly connected to which internal organ. While their theory might have been off, they were onto something about the importance of foot care. Some of these medieval foot treatments were so effective that versions of them were still being used well into the 19th century. Speaking of keeping your foundations clean, medieval folks had some pretty creative ideas about what they wore next to their skin. Linen was the medieval version of breathable workout clothes, except people wore it all the time, not just for exercise. These undergarments were the unsung heroes of medieval hygiene, doing the dirty work of keeping outer clothes clean and absorbing all that daily sweat and grime. You couldn't just grab any old fabric for underwear back then. Linen was king because it actually has natural antibacterial properties and wicks away moisture from the skin. Medieval people figured this out through trial and error. A tailor's guide from 1362 warns against using wool for undergarments because it breeds fleas and creates unseemly itching in sensitive areas. No kidding. Recent analysis of preserved medieval linens shows they were woven in a special way that enhanced their moisture-wicking properties. The washing schedule for these linens tells us a lot about medieval cleanliness. Unlike the heavy outer garments that rarely saw soap and water, medieval folks changed and washed their linen undergarments pretty regularly. A household account book from 1375 shows weekly washing schedules for the family's linens, though the servants apparently only got clean ones every 2 weeks. Medieval job perks weren't exactly great. The same account book includes complaints about servants trying to sneak their linens into the family's wash. Rich people went all out with their underwear game. Some nobles had their linens infused with lavender and rose water before wearing. One particularly fancy nobleman's wardrobe inventory from 1388 lists 24 pairs of perfumed undershirts, medieval equivalent of designer underwear. His steward's diary complains about having to keep track of which shirts were scented with which herbs. Apparently, the lord would throw a fit if he got rose when he wanted lavender. The steward eventually created a complex color coding system using different colored threads to mark which shirt had which scent. But the really interesting part is how medieval people handled sweat. Linen shirts were designed with extra material under the arms and across the back. Medieval sweat zones were well understood. They'd even sew small herb sachets into these areas. A tailor's record from 1391 includes an order for special reinforced armpits with herb pouches for a knight's underwear. Medieval knights, they sweated just like us under all that armor. Some knights became so particular about their herb pouches that they'd travel with spare sachets to change them out during long campaigns. The poor folks got creative with their undergarment situation. They'd often wear the same linen shirt for a while, but turn it inside out halfway through the week. One church sermon from 1359 actually criticizes this practice, calling it a deception before God, though most priests probably did the same thing themselves. Some clever peasants would sew removable patches into the sweatiest parts of their shirts so they could wash just those bits. This practice became so common that some tailors started selling pre-patched shirts with extra removable pieces. Monastery records reveal some pretty strict rules about underwear. Monks were required to change their linens on specific holy days, with some monasteries even having linen inspection after morning prayers. One monastery's expense records show they spent a fortune on lavender oil for the laundry. Apparently, smelling holy was as important as being holy. A monk's diary complains about another brother who kept borrowing his clean shirts before inspection day. The monastery eventually started marking each monk's linens with special symbols to prevent this holy theft. Speaking of laundry, medieval people had special techniques just for washing linens. They'd boil them with wood ash and specific herbs depending on the season. Winter linens got warming herbs like cinnamon, while summer ones got cooling herbs like mint. Archaeological evidence from medieval laundry sites shows traces of these different herb combinations preserved in the soil. Scientists have even recreated some of these ancient laundry recipes and found they were surprisingly effective at killing bacteria. The whole business of linen undergarments was taken so seriously that some towns had professional linen inspectors who checked the quality of fabric being sold for underwear. A court record from 1382 mentions a merchant being fined for selling false linen. He'd mix cheaper fibers in with the real stuff. The punishment? He had to wear his own fake linen shirt in public for a week. Medieval justice had a sense of humor. This incident apparently inspired a popular tavern song about the itchy merchant that survived in folk records for centuries. All this work with undergarments wasn't just about staying clean. Medieval people had some clever tricks for sweating less in the first place. Nobody likes being sweaty and smelly, including medieval people. But instead of reaching for antiperspirant like we do today, they came up with some pretty creative ways to avoid sweating in the first place. The first trick was their clothing choice. Loose-fitting garments made from wool or linen weren't just a fashion statement, they were medieval air conditioning. These natural fibers actually helped regulate body temperature way better than the tight clothes people wore in later centuries. A tailor's guide from 1366 includes specific instructions for leaving breathing room. in summer clothes. One noble's account book shows he ordered his summer tunics 3 sizes larger than his winter ones. Medieval life hack right there. The same account book includes a complaint from his wife about him looking like he was wearing a tent. Medieval people also discovered that powdered herbs worked great for absorbing sweat. Lavender and rosemary were the medieval version of deodorant, but with a twist. They'd grind these herbs into a fine powder and dust it directly on their skin. A monastery's medical text from 1352 lists different herb combinations for different body types. Apparently, hot-natured people needed cooling herbs like mint, while cold-natured folks got warming ones like sage. The text warned that mixing these up could lead to unseemly sweating at inappropriate times. One poor monk apparently got his herbs mixed up before an important church service and ended up sweating through the entire sermon. People would strategically place herb bundles around their houses to create cool spots during summer. They figured out that certain herbs, when dampened, created a cooling effect as the water evaporated. Archaeological evidence shows special niches in medieval walls that were designed specifically for holding these herb bundles, sort of like medieval swamp coolers. Some wealthy homes even had elaborate systems of these cooling niches connected by air channels. The rich folks took sweat prevention to another level entirely. Some castles had special cooling rooms where servants would sprinkle water on herb-covered floors to create a refreshing atmosphere. A noble's household account from 1389 shows regular payments to a cooling room attendant, whose only job was maintaining the perfect temperature. The attendant even kept detailed records of which herb combinations worked best for different weather conditions. Some of these medieval cooling techniques were so effective that similar methods were still being used in fancy houses centuries later. But perhaps the most ingenious sweat prevention method was their use of vinegar. They dab it on pulse points like wrists and behind ears because they noticed it seemed to help them sweat less. Modern science confirms vinegar can actually affect body temperature regulation. One medical text recommends different vinegars for different seasons: wine vinegar for winter, apple vinegar for summer. A merchant's records show he made a fortune selling special summer vinegar to noble households. He even developed a secret recipe that he refused to write down, taking it to his grave. Town records reveal some pretty amusing regulations about sweat prevention. Some cities had rules about when people could do physical work to avoid excessive sweating in public places. A court document from 1374 mentions a baker being fined for working his ovens during the hottest part of the day, creating unseemly amounts of sweat that offended the marketplace. Medieval workplace regulations were no joke. The same town later built special ventilated bakeries with herb-lined walls to help control the heat. The most surprising discovery comes from monastic records about sweat management during religious services. Monks would position themselves in church based on their tendency to sweat. The heavier sweaters got spots near the windows. One monastery's seating chart actually marks certain spots as cooling stations. A monk's diary complains about being moved to the sweaty section as punishment for falling asleep during prayers. The monastery eventually installed special herb-filled cushions on these hot seats to help control the problem. Scientists studying medieval clothing have found evidence of clever ventilation systems built into formal garments. They'd sew tiny holes in strategic places hidden under decorative elements. One preserved nobleman's tunic had a complex system of hidden vents that would put modern sportswear to shame. The design was so effective that some modern historians think medieval people might have been more comfortable in their fancy clothes than we previously thought. From bathing in rivers to preventing sweat, medieval people may not have had our modern soaps and deodorants, but they sure knew how to stay fresh in their own creative ways.